A Mustang horse chained and left to die in the wilderness. The cruel fate seemed sealed with no one to help, and the bears closing in. But what happened next will shatter everything you thought you knew about survival, courage, and hope. And when the world turned its back on him, this horse found a way to fight back against the odds, against the wilderness, and even against the man who abandoned him. Get ready for a story of resilience that will leave you breathless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. In the dense, shadowy forests of Montana, the sun had just begun to dip behind the towering pines, casting long, eerie shadows over the land. A Mustang, once a proud and powerful creature, now lay trembling and weak in the cold underbrush. His name was Dust, but in this moment, he felt as if all hope had been stripped from him. Dust had been abandoned by a man he had once trusted, a farmer who had been caring for him, but had grown impatient with the Mustang's illness. When Dust fell ill, the farmer, unable to bear the burden of caring for a sick animal, made a decision that would change everything. He chained Dust by the neck to a thick, weathered tree deep in the forest, leaving him to die alone. The forest, a place once full of freedom and adventure, had become Dust's prison. The chains dug into his skin, and every breath he took was a struggle. His body ached not just from the disease that ravaged him, but from the cruel, suffocating chains that bound him to the earth. But Dust was not alone. The sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of distant birds, and the occasional low growl of a predator filled the air. Dust's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and though he could barely stand, he lifted his head one last time, hoping for a miracle. But there was no miracle. Instead, there were bears. The grizzly bear, who had been foraging for food, caught wind of Dust's scent. With a growl, it moved closer, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Dust was too weak to move, too sick to fight. The predator's eyes glistened with hunger, its paws heavy with the intent to claim this poor, defenseless creature as prey. But just as the bear was about to strike, something unexpected happened. The forest stillness was shattered by a voice Dust recognized, but had almost forgotten in his agony. It was a voice that had once offered comfort and security, a voice that promised care. "Hey, get away from him." The figure that emerged from the shadows was a woman, small but determined. Her name was Clara, and she had known Dust for most of her life. She had once worked as a volunteer on the farmer's land, helping with the horses. When she had heard rumors of Dust's disappearance, she knew she had to find him. Her heart told her something was terribly wrong. Clara's heart pounded as she approached the bear, who paused for a moment, sensing the challenge. She raised her arms, shouting again, trying to make herself appear larger, more intimidating. The bear hesitated, its instincts telling it to retreat. Clara's eyes locked with Dust's, and in that moment, she saw the raw pain in his eyes. This was no longer just a rescue mission. This was a fight for life. The bear growled again, but turned and slowly retreated into the trees. Clara rushed to Dust's side, her hands trembling as she worked to release him from the chains. He barely reacted, his body too weak to respond. As she finally freed him, she whispered words of comfort, promising him he would never be alone again. Dust, despite his frailty, nuzzled her gently. He was still alive, but not for long if she didn't act quickly. Clara didn't hesitate. She had spent years volunteering at animal shelters, working with horses, and had never been more determined than she was now. Dust, though barely conscious, was a fighter, and she could see that in his eyes. She knew she couldn't let him down. With gentle hands, she cupped Dust's face, whispering, "I've got you now. You're not alone anymore." Her voice, though soft, carried a strength that Dust could feel even in his weakened state. The bond between them was instant and undeniable, built over years of unspoken trust. But rescuing Dust was only the first challenge. Clara needed to get him to safety, and that meant traveling back through the forest to the nearest veterinary clinic. The journey ahead would be grueling, but her heart was set on one thing. She would do whatever it took to save him. She struggled to get Dust on his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. Each step he took seemed more painful than the last. Clara's heart ached for him, but she couldn't afford to give in to despair. She wrapped his neck with a thick rope she had brought with her, gently pulling him along the narrow trail that led back to civilization. The forest, which once seemed serene and inviting, now felt like a dangerous labyrinth. The path was rough, the terrain unforgiving. Clara's mind raced, calculating every step. The wind had picked up, and the sky had darkened as if nature itself was testing her resolve. But she couldn't stop, not now. As the hours passed, Clara felt the weight of Dust's suffering pressing against her own chest. She could feel the exhaustion creeping into her muscles, but she pushed on. Dust stumbled again, his body trembling, but this time Clara didn't pull on the rope. Instead, she crouched down beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You're strong," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. The forest was eerily quiet now. No birds chirped, no rustling of leaves in the wind. The silence felt oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Dust snorted softly, lifting his head for the first time in hours, his dark eyes meeting hers. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to ignite a flicker of hope in Clara's heart. They were in this together. Clara knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The veterinary clinic was still miles away, and Dust's condition was deteriorating. She had no choice but to push forward, hoping the worst would not come to pass before they reached safety. The clouds above had thickened, and the wind howled, louder as if nature itself was warning them. But Clara refused to listen. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she kept moving. Dust's weak steps were a reminder that he needed her now more than ever. The world outside the forest was a place of hope, but it felt as distant as the stars above. Clara's determination was all that kept them going. And just when she thought she couldn't take another step, a distant light appeared through the trees. A small cabin, a sign of civilization. The vet clinic was just beyond it. Clara's heart surged with relief. She had made it, but she wasn't sure if Dust could hold on much longer. Clara's legs were on fire, each step feeling like it would be her last. The light from the cabin flickered like a beacon of hope, but it seemed to grow more distant the closer. The exhaustion was overwhelming, and every part of her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop now. Dust was depending on her. As they approached the cabin, Clara heard the sound of footsteps, quick and purposeful. The door swung open, and a tall, older man with graying hair stood in the threshold. He looked at them with immediate concern, his gaze fixed on Dust, who could barely keep his legs beneath him. "Is he all right?" The man's voice was gruff but filled with urgency. He's barely hanging on," Clara replied, her voice shaky. "I need help." "Please." Without another word, the man stepped aside, allowing Clara and Dust to enter. She led the exhausted Mustang into the small room where the faint smell of antiseptic and hay filled the air. A table sat in the center of the room, and several tools were neatly arranged nearby. The man, who Clara now realized was a veterinarian, didn't waste time. He immediately went to work examining Dust with practiced hands. Clara stood back, trying to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She had done everything she could to get him here, but it was now in the vet's hands. For what felt like hours, the veterinarian worked in silence, occasionally muttering to himself. Clara couldn't tear her eyes away from Dust, whose breathing had become shallow and uneven. She whispered his name, hoping he could hear her. "Hang in there, Dust. You're going to make it." Finally, the vet stepped back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He met Clara's gaze, his expression serious but not devoid of hope. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But the good news is there's no major organ damage. With the right care, he can recover." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You're sure?" He nodded. "It won't be easy, but he's strong. He fought through a lot just to get here. I believe he has the will to live." The relief that washed over Clara felt like a wave crashing down on her, and for the first time since Dust had been chained in the forest, she allowed herself to breathe. She looked at the Mustang, his eyes now half open, and she felt a bond between them that was stronger than anything she could put into words. For the next few days, Clara stayed by Dust's side, helping to nurse him back to health. The vet clinic had become their refuge, a sanctuary from the horrors Dust had endured. Clara was there for every feed, every small step forward, every sign of progress. She spoke to him softly, always encouraging, always reminding him that he wasn't alone anymore. Dust began to gain strength, though it was a slow process. His legs, once shaky and uncertain, were now more stable. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, were beginning to shine with the spark of life again. Clara's heart swelled with pride as she watched him recover, and the bond between them deepened with each passing day. But even as Dust grew stronger, Clara knew that the hardest part of his journey was yet to come. The scars of his abuse would take time to heal, both physically and emotionally. The emotional toll of being abandoned by the one who was supposed to care for him would not be something that would disappear overnight, but Clara was committed. She would be there for him no matter what. One evening, as Clara sat beside Dust in the small paddock behind the cabin, she noticed him standing a little taller, a little more confident. He had taken his first few steps on his own, and they were steady. "You're doing it, Dust," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be okay." Dust turned his head toward her, his dark eyes soft and filled with trust. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped moving. The bond between them was stronger than ever, built not just on survival, but on the promise of a new beginning. And as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Clara knew that their journey together had only just begun. The days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself waking up early every morning to tend to Dust. The clinic had become more than just a place of healing. It was now home. She spent every waking moment with the Mustang, watching him regain strength and, more importantly, watching him rediscover his trust in humans. But there were challenges ahead. Clara had hoped that once Dust was healthy again, she could find a peaceful place for him to live, a sanctuary where he could roam free, away from the cruelty he'd endured. But finding the right place was proving to be more difficult than she'd anticipated. The world outside the small clinic was still full of uncertainty. Clara knew that Dust could never be returned to the wild. He had been too conditioned by his past. He needed care, love, and a stable environment to thrive. But the rescue center she contacted had all said the same thing. They were full. There was no room for a horse like Dust. That's when the reality of her situation hit her. She was going to have to make a decision. She could either return to her life back in the city, or she could stay and fight for Dust, fight for a future where he wasn't just another sad story of neglect and abandonment. One evening, as Clara sat on the edge of Dust's stall, watching him graze in the fading light, she realized that there was no choice. She couldn't leave him now. They had come too far together. She had made a promise to him when she first rescued him, and she intended to keep it. The thought of taking Dust home with her was overwhelming. She didn't know where she'd put him or how she would care for him, but she knew she couldn't turn her back on him, not after everything they had been through. "I'm not going anywhere, Dust," Clara whispered, brushing the horse's mane with her hand. "We'll figure this out together." As she stood up and dusted herself off, Clara heard the sound of a truck approaching. She glanced toward the gate and saw a familiar face. Jackson, the vet from the clinic, was carrying a box of supplies and a concerned look on his face. "I've been thinking about you too," Jackson said, walking toward Clara. "I know you're trying to figure things out. There's a place, a sanctuary, a few hours from here. It's not a fancy place, but they specialize in horses like Dust. I've talked to them, and they're willing to take him in." Clara's heart skipped a beat. This was the news she had been waiting for. "Are you sure?" Clara asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Is it really going to be okay for him there?" Jackson nodded, a kind smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They have the experience and the space. I think it'll be good for him. He'll be with other horses, and he'll be cared for properly." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew that this was the right step for Dust. As much as she had hoped to keep him with her, she also understood that he needed more than she could provide alone. This was the best chance for him to live the life he deserved. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you for helping him." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's what we do. He's a survivor, Clara, and so are you." The next day, Clara prepared Dust for the journey ahead. The sun had barely risen. casting a golden light over the fields. As they loaded him into a trailer, his once frail body now carried a quiet strength, his coat gleaming with health. Clara held her breath as the trailer door closed, her heart aching at the thought of leaving him behind. But as the truck drove away, Clara knew that this was just the beginning. This was on his way to a new life, one filled with hope, freedom, and the kind of love he had always deserved. And she, too, was starting a new chapter, one where she could continue to fight for the animals who needed her. As the truck disappeared from view, Clara wiped away a tear, her heart full. She had done it. She had saved Dust, and now he had a future. And no matter where life took her next, she would never forget the Mustang who had changed everything. Months passed, and the memory of Dust's journey lingered in Clara's heart. Like an unspoken promise, she had visited the sanctuary where he now lived, and what she saw filled her with both joy and sorrow. Dust had transformed. His coat was glossy, his muscles strong, and his once hesitant steps were now confident and sure. But there was a sadness in his eyes, a trace of the abandonment he had once endured. Clara couldn't deny that her heart ached every time she saw him, knowing that she couldn't offer him the life he had now found. But there was more to Dust's story than anyone could have anticipated. One afternoon, Clara received a phone call from the sanctuary. It was the same veterinarian who had helped Dust recover. "Jackson, Clara, you need to come by the sanctuary as soon as you can," Jackson said, his voice tight with concern. "Something's happened with Dust. We're not sure yet, but it's serious." Clara's heart dropped. Panic seized her chest. "What happened? Is he okay?" "We don't know yet. He's been acting strange all morning, and now he's refusing to eat. We've been monitoring him, but he's not responding like he should." Clara didn't think twice. She dropped everything and rushed to the sanctuary. Her mind raced with thoughts of Dust, of everything he had been through. She couldn't bear the thought of him suffering again, not after everything they had fought for. When she arrived, she found Dust lying down in the shade of a large oak tree, his once bright eyes dull and distant. He barely lifted his head as she approached, and the sight of him struck Clara with a deep sense of dread. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "What's going on? Talk to me, Dust. You've been through so much, you can't give up now." Jackson walked over, his brow furrowed with worry. "He's not physically sick. We've checked him over, and he's not in pain, but he's been off for days now, withdrawn, quiet. We're not sure what's causing it." Clara sat beside him, gently stroking his mane. She couldn't understand it. Dust had been thriving, seemed to be healing. So why was he now sinking into himself? Then it hit her. It wasn't his body that needed healing anymore. It was his heart. Dust hadn't just been abandoned by his previous owner. He had been left alone in the world. He had learned to trust Clara. Yes, but he was still fighting the shadows of his past. The trauma had become a part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. And Clara realized with a start that Dust wasn't just physically healing. He needed time, patience, and love to heal emotionally. She stayed with him for hours that day, talking softly, brushing his coat, and letting him know he was safe. She whispered promises to him, telling him that no one would ever hurt him again, that she would always be there. Slowly, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dust's breathing began to steady. His ears perked up, and finally, he nuzzled her hand, the quietest gesture of trust that Clara had ever received from him. Jackson watched from a distance, his face softened by understanding. "He just needs time," he said, his voice calm. "He's not giving up, Clara. He's just been through too much." Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. This was stronger than anyone could ever understand. He had fought through his past, through his pain, and now he was on a path to recovery that no one could take from him. The next day, Clara made a decision. She would stay at the sanctuary for as long as it took. Dust needed her, and though the road ahead might not be easy, she was ready for whatever came next. She visited him every day, sitting with him, talking to him, giving him the support he needed to move forward. It wasn't just about physical healing anymore. It was about healing together, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and Dust began to flourish once more. His spark returned, and the old joy that had once filled his eyes was coming back. He would run across the pasture, his hooves pounding the earth in the same rhythmic beat of a Mustang who knew freedom. But it was more than just physical recovery, it was emotional rebirth. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Dust run with the other horses, his spirit untamed and unbroken. She smiled to herself, knowing that this wasn't the end of their journey, it was just the beginning. And as the sun set behind the hills, Clara whispered to the wind, "You made it, Dust. You found your freedom." Dust was thriving more than anyone, including Clara, could have imagined. His coat gleamed in the sunlight. His muscles rippled with strength as he galloped across the fields. Every day he grew more confident, more like the horse he was always meant to be. But despite his recovery, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Dust's story, a chapter still unfinished, a part of his past that needed closure. She had been visiting him at the sanctuary for months now, and with each passing week, he had grown more attached to her. The bond they shared was unspoken yet undeniable. She had been his savior, his protector, and in return, Dust had become her greatest source of strength. One morning, as Clara was preparing to leave the sanctuary after spending the day with Dust, Jackson pulled her aside. "Clara, there's something I think you should know," Jackson said, his voice serious. "We've gotten a call. A man claims to be Dust's original owner. He's asking for him back." Clara's stomach churned. She hadn't expected this. The very thought of Dust being returned to the cruel man who had once abandoned him seemed unthinkable. "What does he want with Dust?" Clara asked, her voice tight with anger. Jackson hesitated before answering. "He says he wants to make things right, but from what I've gathered, this man isn't exactly someone we can trust." Clara's heart raced. She knew what needed to be done, but it wasn't going to be easy. Dust had come so far and had finally found a place where he belonged. The idea of him being taken away to be subjected to who knew what kind of treatment was unbearable. "I'll go with you to meet him," Clara said, determination rising in her chest. "If this man truly wants to make things right, then he needs to understand just how much Dust has been through. I won't let him take him without a fight." Jackson nodded, his face set in grim lines. "Let's see what he has to say, but be careful. I don't trust him." Clara and Jackson drove to the address provided by the man who claimed to be Dust's owner. The area was remote, far from the sanctuary, and the safe, peaceful place that Dust now called home. Clara's gut twisted with unease as they pulled up to a dilapidated barn. It was clear that this wasn't the place of a man who had any real intention of caring for Dust. A man in his mid-40s stood outside, smoking a cigarette. His face was rough, his eyes cold, and his posture suggested he wasn't the type to back down easily. "You must be Clara," the man said, his voice gruff. "I'm Tom, Dust's rightful owner." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm Clara. I've been caring for Dust for months now, and I can tell you right now, he's not going anywhere." Tom's eyes narrowed, and he flicked his cigarette to the ground. "You don't get to decide what happens to him. He's mine, and I'm taking him back." Clara stood her ground. "You don't get it, do you? Dust isn't just yours. He's a living, breathing being who has been through hell, and I will not let you take him back to that." Tom stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You think I don't know what happened to him? I had my reasons for leaving him out there. He wasn't good enough for the ranch. He wasn't what I needed." Clara's blood boiled, but she didn't back down. "That's not an excuse. He's been through enough pain and suffering. He doesn't deserve to go back to someone who abandoned him." There was a long silence as the two stood face to face, the tension thick in the air. Clara's heart was racing, but she stood tall, refusing to let this man intimidate her. She knew she couldn't let Dust return to a life of misery. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom took a step back. His expression shifted. There was something in his eyes now, a flicker of something like regret. "You're right," he said, his voice softer now. "I screwed up. I wasn't ready for him. I don't deserve to have him." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to argue, to insist, but instead, he was acknowledging his mistakes. This wasn't the man Clara had imagined. "I never thought he'd survive," not after what happened. But if he's doing better with you, then maybe it's for the best. Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had been ready to fight for Dust with everything she had, but she hadn't expected this unexpected shift in Tom's attitude. "I'll take full responsibility for Dust from now on," Clara said, her voice firm. "He's in good hands now, and he's not going anywhere." Tom nodded slowly, as if the decision had already been made. "I don't deserve him," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Maybe it's better this way." Clara didn't have time for any more words. She turned and walked back to the truck, Jackson by her side. As they drove away from the barn, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. This was safe, and for the first time in a long time, Clara believed that everything was going to be okay. The days after the confrontation with Tom were a blur of emotions. Clara couldn't believe how close she had come to losing Dust, but the relief of knowing he was safe and no longer in the clutches of someone who didn't understand him was overwhelming. Dust had been through so much, and Clara had vowed to ensure that he would never again face the kind of neglect he had endured in the past. With time, Dust's recovery only grew more remarkable. His coat shimmered under the sun, and his once cautious, hesitant steps were now confident and strong. He no longer flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. He had come to trust Clara completely, and that bond between them had deepened in ways neither of them had expected. But it wasn't just Dust who had changed. Clara found herself transformed, too. Caring for Dust had brought her a sense of purpose, something she hadn't realized she was missing. She no longer felt like just a person walking through life. She felt like she was living with intention, with meaning, and every day she felt a deep, profound gratitude for the horse who had come into her life when she needed him most. One sunny afternoon, Clara stood by the fence, watching Dust gallop freely across the field. His mane flew behind him like a flag of freedom, and his hooves pounded against the earth in perfect rhythm. For the first time, she realized just how far they had both come. Jackson walked up beside her, a small smile on his face. "You've done something incredible with him," he said, his voice warm with admiration. Clara watched Dust for a moment longer before answering. "No," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He did it. He healed himself. All I did was give him the space to trust again." Jackson nodded. "Sometimes that's all a horse needs, someone to believe in them when no one else will." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. "I never thought I'd be the one to make a difference. I thought I was just going to be a caretaker, but it's more than that. We saved each other." Jackson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You did. And now look at him. He's a whole new horse." Clara's chest tightened with emotion. She could see it. The spirit of the Mustang was no longer hidden beneath layers of fear and pain. Dust had found his strength, and so had she. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the field, Clara walked out to where Dust stood. She reached out, her fingers brushing his soft muzzle. He nuzzled her gently, his eyes full of trust, and for the first time, Clara realized that it wasn't just about saving a horse. It was about a shared journey of healing and redemption. Dust had found freedom, but so had she. The bond they shared was something beyond words, a quiet understanding, a mutual respect for the paths they had walked, paths filled with struggle, but ultimately paths that had led them to each other. "Thank you," Clara whispered softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Dust snorted in response, his breath warm against her skin. And in that moment, Clara knew that no matter what happened in the future, she would always have him. He would always have her. They were a team, bound by something far greater than the world had ever tried to take from them. And as the last light of day faded into the twilight, Clara made a silent promise to Dust, a promise that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. No one would ever hurt him again. No one would ever leave him behind. They were free. If this story inspired you, remember the bonds we form with animals are truly transformative. They teach us courage, patience, and the power of unconditional love. If you believe in the power of healing through connection, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with others who need to hear a story of hope. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.